Check this out, BCM Raider here, bringing you another Commander deck tech. Today we're looking at the Gitrog monster. This is a all-in lands matters deck, so we're going to focus on every single aspect of lands. Whether lands entering the battlefield, going to the graveyard, putting as many lands on the battlefield as possible, and just doing fun, crazy, broken, dumb things. The Gitrog himself, he's a 6/6 Death Toucher with, at the beginning of our upkeep, we sacrifice the Gitrog monster unless we sacrifice a land. But we can play a additional land on each of our turns. And then whenever one or more lands are put into a graveyard from anywhere, we get to draw a card. So, let's get right into it. We're running two very specific planeswalkers that are going to help us with all this land stuff. So we have Wrenn and Realmbreaker. This one is very powerful. This has a static effect where lands we control can tap for any color mana. We can plus Wrenn and Realmbreaker. Up to one target land will become a 3/3 elemental with vigilance and hexproof and haste. Until our next turn, it'll still be a land. We can -2, mill 3 cards, and put a permanent from among those milled into our hand. And -7, we get an emblem where we can play lands and cast permanents from our graveyard. So that's going to be really, really fun. Now we have Wrenn and 7. This one is going to enter with 5 loyalty counters. We're going to +1 Wrenn and 7. We can look at the top 4 cards of our library, then put all lands revealed this way into our hand and the rest into our graveyard. Or -3, we create a green tree folk creature where its power and toughness are equal to the number of lands we control. And then -8, we're going to return all permanent cards from our graveyard to our hand. Then we get an emblem where we have no maximum hand size. Okay, let's get into the creatures. All these creatures have a very specific role, but we're only running 6 actual creatures that have landfall. So we have Scoot Swarm. Whenever a land enters the battlefield, we're going to create a 1/1 green insect. But if we control 6 or more lands, we're going to create an exact copy of Scoot Swarm. Now we have my personal favorite with Tireless Tracker. Whenever a land enters the battlefield, we get to investigate. Whenever we sacrifice a clue, we're going to put a +1 counter on Tireless Tracker. Now we have Mossborn Hydra. This has Trample. It'll enter the battlefield with a +1 counter on it. And then whenever a land enters the battlefield, we're going to double the number of +1 counters on Mossborn Hydra. Now we have Rampaging Batloss. This is a 6/6 with Trample, and whenever a land enters the battlefield, we're going to create a 4/4 green beast token. Now we have Obnixilis the Fallen. This is a 3/3 demon. Whenever a land enters the battlefield, we can have target player lose 3 life, and if they do, we're going to put 3 +1 counters on Obnixilis. Now we have the OG Avenger of Zendikar. When Avenger of Zendikar enters the battlefield, we're going to get a 0/1 green plant token for each land we control. And then whenever a land enters the battlefield, we're going to put a +1 counter on each plant creature we control. Now we have a bunch of creatures that are going to synergize with all these lands. So first up, we have Deathrite Shaman. This has 3 separate activated abilities. We can exile target land from a graveyard, and when we do, we're going to add 1 mana of any color. We can pay a black, exile target instant or sorcery from any graveyard, and each opponent is going to lose 2 life. Or we pay a green, exile target creature, and we gain 2 life. Now we have good old Steve, or Secure Tribuilder. We're going to sacrifice Secure Tribuilder, then search for a basic land and put it on the battlefield. Now we have Elvish Reclaimer. Elvish Reclaimer will get +2/+2 as long as there's 3 or more lands in our graveyard. But we can pay 2 colorless, activate Elvish Reclaimer, sacrifice a land, and then search for any land and put it on the battlefield tapped. Now we have Eternal Witness. Eternal Witness is going to allow us to return any card from our graveyard back to our hand. Now we have 6. Number 6 attacks. We're going to mill 3 cards. Then we can put a land from among those into our hand. But as long as it's our turn, non-land permanents in our graveyard have retrace. Now we have good old Raminep Excavator. This is kind of like Steve's cousin, but he's going to allow us to play lands from our graveyard. Now we have Courser of Crewfix. We're going to play with the top card revealed, and if it's a land, we can play that land from the top of our library. And whenever any land enters the battlefield under our control, we gain 1 life. Now we have a bunch of additional land creatures. So we have Wayward Swordtooth. This has Ascend. It can't attack or block unless we have the City's Blessing. Now we have the original Oracle of Moldiah. We're going to play with the top card revealed. If it's a land, we can play it. And we can play additional lands. Now we have Azusa Lost But Seeking. This will allow us to play 2 additional lands. Now we have a fun one. We have Scourge Familiar. He's going to allow us to discard a card, and we're going to add 1 black mana. Now we have some very powerful win conditions. We have Jared, Golgari Lichlord. Jared, Golgari Lichlord is going to get +1/+1 for each creature in our graveyard, but we're not going to be focused too much on that aspect. We're going to be focused on sacrificing a swamp and forest to continually draw cards if we have the Gitrog monster out. And then eventually, if we have a creature that's power and toughness is equal to the number of lands we control, and if that creature is big enough, we can just activate Jared to sacrifice that creature, and then each opponent is going to lose life equal to that creature's power. Now we have Titania, Protector of Argoth. Just when Titania enters the battlefield, we're going to return any land from our graveyard back to the battlefield. And then whenever a land we control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, we're going to create a 5/3 elemental. Now we have Greensleeves, Morrow's Sorcerer. This has protection from planeswalkers and wizards. It's very narrow, but its power and toughness are equal to the number of lands we control. And whenever any land enters the battlefield, we're going to create a 3/3 Badger. Now we have Ancient Green Warden. This is a 5/7 with reach. He will allow us to play lands from our graveyard. However, if a land entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent we control, that trigger is going to trigger an additional time. Now we have Lumra, Bellow of the Woods. This is a newer one I'm not too familiar with. Power and toughness are equal to the number of lands we control. It also has vigilance and reach, but when it enters the battlefield, we're going to mill 4 cards and then return all lands from our graveyard to the battlefield tapped. It doesn't have to be part of the 4 cards that we milled. So if we already have a lot of lands in our graveyard, we mill 4, and then we're going to return every single one of those lands from our graveyard back to the battlefield. Okay, now we have Worldbreaker. This is a 5/7 Eldrazi that has no color because it's devoid of color. But when we cast Worldbreaker, we're going to exile target artifact, enchantment, or land. It also has reach, but we can pay 2 generic mana and 1 actual colorless mana. We're going to sacrifice a land. Then we can return Worldbreaker from our graveyard back to our hand. Okay, now we got a very powerful one. We have Terrastodon. When Terrastodon enters the battlefield, we can destroy up to 3 target non-creature permanents And for each permanent put into a graveyard this way, its controller is going to put a 3/3 green elephant token on the battlefield. It's also a 9/9. Now we have Kozilek, Butcher of Truth. This is a very powerful Eldrazi. When we cast it, we're going to draw 4 cards. It also has Annihilator 4. And if Kozilek would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, we're going to shuffle our entire graveyard back in. That way we can continually get these lands from our graveyard shuffled back in our deck. Okay, let's get into the artifacts. We have our Soul Ring. We have Zuron Orb. We're going to activate this, sacrifice a land, and gain 2 life. Now we have Crucible of Worlds. That way we can continually play lands from our graveyard. Now we have Horn of Greed. Whenever any player plays a land, that player draws a card. Okay, let's get into the enchantments. We have Exploration. That way we can play additional lands. We have Burgeoning. Whenever any opponent plays a land, we can put a land from our hand on the battlefield. Now we have Splunking. This is only here to ensure that all lands that come into play under our side are untapped. Now we have Squandered Resources. We're going to sacrifice a land, and we're going to add 1 mana that land could produce. Now we have Colney Heart Expedition. This has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield, we're going to put a quest counter on Colney Heart Expedition. And then when there's 3 quest counters, we can remove those quest counters, sacrifice Colney Heart Expedition, search our library for 2 basic lands, and put it on the battlefield tapped. Now we have Pernicious Deed. Pay X, sacrifice Pernicious Deed, and destroy every single artifact, creature, and enchantment with converted mana cost X or less. Okay, let's get into the instants. We have Crop Rotation. That way we can sacrifice a land, trigger the Gitrog monster, then search our library for any land we want and put it on the battlefield. Now we have Harrow. We're going to sacrifice a land as a additional cost and then search for 2 basics and put it on the battlefield. Now we have Realms Uncharted. This is basically Fact or Fiction for lands. We're going to search our library for 4 specific lands that have different names. An opponent is going to choose 2 of those cards, and the rest go into the graveyard. The other 2 go into our hand. Now we got some removal. So we have Beast Within. We're going to destroy target permanent, and its controller will create a 3/3 Beast token. We can target our own lands with this if we really need to. Now we have Constantness. This is a fog effect, but it has buyback. The buyback is sacrifice a land. So the buyback is going to synergize very well with the Gitrog monster. And our opponents are never going to deal combat damage to us with this card. Okay, let's get into the sorceries. We have our Green Sun Zenith, so we can go get whatever green creature and put it on the battlefield. Now we have Animus Awakening. We're going to reveal the top X cards and put all lands from among those on the battlefield tapped. However, this does have Spell Mastery, so if there are 2 or more instants or sorceries in our graveyard, those lands are going to enter untapped. Now we have Seasons Past. We're going to return any number of cards with different mana costs from our graveyard back to our hand, and then we're going to put Seasons Past back on the bottom of our library. Now we have Traverse the Uvenwald. We're going to search for a basic land and put it into our hand, but if we have Delirium or 4 different card types in our graveyard, we search for either a creature or any land and put that card into our hand instead. Now we have Cultivate. We're going to search our library for 2 basic lands, One of them is going to go into our hand, and the other one is going to go on the battlefield tapped. Now we have Search for Tomorrow. This has Suspend for 2 turns. Then we're going to search for a basic land and put it on the battlefield. Now we have Regrowth. That way we can return any card from our graveyard back to our hand. Now we have Kadama's Reach. We're going to search for 2 basics. One goes into our hand, and one goes on the battlefield tapped. Now we have Demonic Tutor, so we can go get whatever card we want. Now we have Splendid Reclamation. We're going to return all lands from our graveyard back to the battlefield tapped. Now we have Life of the Loam. Because we're going to be drawing cards, we're going to be utilizing the dredge mechanic. But when we cast Life from the Loam, we're going to return any 3 target lands back to our hand. Now we have Gaia's Blessing. We can shuffle up to 3 target cards back into our library and then draw a card. But if Gaia's Blessing was put into our graveyard from our library, such as milling, we're going to shuffle our entire graveyard back in. Now we have some removal. We have our Damnation and Toxic Deluge. Now we have a very specific win condition when we have a bunch of mana and nothing else to do with it. Might as well dump it into Torment of Hailfire. This is a very powerful card. We're going to repeat this process X times. Each opponent is going to lose 3 life unless they sacrifice a non-land permanent or discard a card. Okay, let's get into the land base. First up, we have 6 actual fetch lands that we're going to use to search our library for lands and put them on the battlefield. So we have Prismatic Vista. This one will only get basic lands, but it won't be tapped. Similar to that, we have Fable Passage. This only gets basic lands, but that land will enter tapped unless we control 4 or more other lands. Now we have Verdant Catacombs to go get any swamp or forest card. Now we have the original fetch lands with Mountain Valley and Grasslands. Now we have Jund Panorama. This is just another fetch land that will allow us to go get a swamp or forest card. Now we need the lands to go get. So we have Overgrown Tomb, Underground Mortuary, Woodland Chasm, and we have our check land with Woodland Cemetery. Now we have some lands that are going to produce a lot of mana or very specific mana. So we have Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth. Every single land is now a forest in addition to its other types. Urborg. Every land is a swamp in addition to its other types. Now we have Lotus Field. This is a hexproof land. It'll enter tapped, and when it enters, we have to sacrifice 2 lands. But we're not going to worry too much about that because it's going to provide 3 mana of 1 color. Similar to that, we have Lotus Veil. Now we have a whole bunch of utility lands. So we have Beseju Who Endures. We're going to discard this and destroy target artifact, enchantment, or non-basic land a opponent controls. And then they search for a land with a basic type and put that land on the battlefield. And this ability will cost 1 colorless less to activate if we control a legendary creature. Similar to that, we have Takanuma. We're going to mill 3 cards and then return a creature or planeswalker back to our hand. Now we have another dredge land. We have Dakmor Salvage. This is dredge 2. And in case we need to exile our opponent's graveyard, we have Bajuka Bog. We have a couple cycling lands. So we have Barren Moor and Tranquil Thicket. Now we have the good old Dryad Arbor. That way we can go get this turn 1 with Green Sun Zenith. Now we have some colorless lands that are going to help. So we have Glacial Chasm. This has a cumulative upkeep of pain to life, but when it enters the battlefield, we have to sacrifice a land. But if this land is in play, we can attack, and all damage that's dealt to us is reduced to 0. Now we have Mazavith to deal with our opponents attacking us. Now we have Thespian Stage. That way we can copy any land we want. I kind of like copying this land with Dark Depths, because once we copy Dark Depths, we're going to have an exact copy. So one of them is going to legend roll out, and that land is going to have no ice counters on it. So we're going to get the 2020 Merit Liege. We're going to get this guy. Now we have Drowned Yard Temple. We're going to use this to consistently put back on the battlefield so we can keep sacking it over and over and over. Now we have Thawing Glaciers. This will enter tapped, but we're going to pay a colorless, search our library for a basic land, and put that onto the battlefield. Then we're going to return Thawing Glaciers back to our hand. Now we have Ghost Quarter. We're going to sacrifice Ghost Quarter and destroy any land we want, and then its controller can search for a basic land and put it on the battlefield. Now we have Strip Mine, when you just need to blow it up. Now we have Tectonic Edge. This is kind of like Wasteland, but a lot cheaper. We have 6 swamps and 6 forests. And that was the Commander deck tech for the Gitrog monster, the big scary frog. I really hope you guys enjoyed this Lands Matters deck. If you guys have any suggestions, please put them in the comments below, and I will provide the entire deck list to this video in the comments below. It'll be a link to Moxfield, so be sure to like, comment, subscribe, follow me on TikTok, share these videos, and I'll see you guys in the next one.